and thanks for coming tonight. We're going to start in the beginning, obviously, and with one of the starting points of the book, which was when Sofia challenged herself to a shopping detox, basically meaning that she wasn't going to buy any clothes for a full year. And I love all the stories that you tell in the book, which has kind of almost like a diary layout at the beginning of the book. I think you should tell the background of the idea of the shopping detox.
Yeah, basically I had been going to a lot of different fashion weeks, and after 4-5 years doing it, I felt that the same trends were coming back every single season. Every fall it was the grunge trend and some sort of S&M trend going on, and every spring there was prints on prints, and I felt that me as a journalist were talking to other journalists and we were trying to make something new out of something that wasn't new. We were just trying to describe it in a new way, and I was starting to feel bored with fashion, and fashion is something that I feel very passionate about. It's something it's a way to express your creativity, but I was starting to lose it. So I decided to do an experiment on my own, to try a year-long shopping detox, just to see what would happen to me. Would I become more excited about clothes again, or what would really happen? So I just started pretty quietly, August 1st in 2009. I told some friends, but most of the people that was surrounding me I didn't tell, because I wanted it to be my own project. So what I discovered for the first 3 months was that it took me around 3 months to get rid of the addiction, because even though I didn't feel like I was a shopping addict, I realized that me, as most people today, are addicted to going into stores, buy something when you feel bored. When you need to celebrate something, you buy clothes out of the wrong reason, and it has nothing to do with fashion. So it took me around 3 months to get rid of the addiction. And then throughout the project, Anna and I started to read old books from the 1920s to the 1970s to see how did people relate to fashion and clothing consumption back then, when we didn't have fast fashion. And what we discovered was that fashion has always moved forward, but what we have today is shopping. Shopping is our only tool to actually change our wardrobe. And this is not true, and this was something that we wanted to highlight. What we also discovered was that our consumption behavior has changed a lot the last 10 years. In Sweden, for example, we consume 40% more clothes than we did 9 years ago. We consume on an average around 50 items a year, and that's a lot of clothes that is coming into our wardrobe. And we were wondering, why is this happening? And the media and a lot of the fast fashion companies talk about the democratization of fashion, that making trends accessible, but it's just a way to market consumption, basically. So we also were trying to figure out, how did we end up in the fast fashion?
I also tried a version of this detox. We created a 30-day version of Sofia's 1-year-long detox that I tried about halfway through your year-long detox. And even though I kind of stopped buying clothes while we were working on the book, it was really great to do this very active and conscious and aware month of not buying any clothes and paying attention to habits that you have around consumption of clothes and shopping. And I found it really liberating, actually. It really simplified my life in a lot of ways to just completely exclude this habit. So I thought it was a really great thing. And also something that I think a lot of people think about, saving money when you do a shopping detox, which you obviously do. But we've also been talking about things like you talked about the time that you saved.
Yeah. Because for me it was easier to calculate the time. So what I discovered was that I saved around 27 hours a month and 13 and a half days over the year by not going into stores. So I had a lot of time to spend on other things. But Timo, you also went through a shopping detox.
I did. This was 3 years ago. And I only figured out today that it was probably partly inspired by yours, in that we have a mutual friend who, just coming up on 3 years ago, shared about her detox, which was in fact inspired by Sofia's, and that got me inspired by the thought, because as far back as 10 years ago, it was to do with storage space, but I counted my t-shirts, and I owned at the time over 100 t-shirts, which I had no idea until I counted them, and I was kind of ashamed by that. And then 3 years ago it just suited me for that time reason, and also just the money reason, and also I was just curious to see how difficult it would be, and so it was, in fact, I found the year so easy that I went for 2 years. And after the 2 years, I really ran out of trousers that I could wear to work. So I had to stop, at least temporarily. But it was a really interesting experience, so I'm really excited about your book for that reason.
And Gill, you also went through some sort of detox, you told us earlier today.
Yeah, not consciously though. I mean, I don't think I've ever been able to, or had the willpower to detox out of anything. But I mean, I've always worn vintage clothing, and mostly because I always wanted to buy one decent thing. Even if it was like 1 or 2 decent things a year, might cost me, I'd spend thousands of dollars on something, but it would be one thing that I could mix with other easy stuff that was cheap and cheerful, but not fast fashion, and that's a really important distinction. So I think without even realising it, I was on some kind of detox. I don't have many clothes. I mean, a lot of my friends, just because we've got a fashion company, think that I own tons of clothes, and I don't. I've probably, honestly, only got about 30 or 40 things, which even to me, saying that sounds like quite a lot, but it's really not in today's society. But more recently, I think because I've started Bionesque, and this is a start-up business, so you basically live on, what somebody actually recently said to me, you live on, your life is built around ramen profits, which means that you've just got enough money to eat ramen and you'll be sustained. So I guess I even cut back even more, and so without even realising I've been on detox. And what's interesting about that is that it never felt like a sacrifice. So I guess when you started out, it felt like you had to sacrifice something, and it's just sort of subconsciously been a part of my life, and probably why I ended up starting Bionesque.
We were just briefly touching the subject of fast fashion, because it has been so prominent for the last 10 years. How did we end up in this fashion climate? What do you say, Timo?
I would say that it's the only logical endpoint to the kind of, I guess, society that we are. Because you can kind of see the roots of it going as far back as the Great Depression of the 30s, and this idea of planned obsolescence, which was really created to encourage consumption. And I think fashion has done it incredibly well, particularly in the last 10 years, with some very unfortunate consequences. I mean, you talked about the volumes of clothing being bought in Sweden. It's even higher in the US. I think it's about 68 garments per year in the US that we buy on average. And also in the second-hand garment scene, the quality of fast fashion is such that that when we discard fast fashion, there's very little that can actually be done to it. Often we think that we're doing a good thing by donating it to Goodwill or whatever, but in fact often the quality is so bad that it can't really even be resold, and it's a waste on so many levels. It's a waste of resources, but I think it's it's also kind of a cultural waste, I think. And it's such a waste of time, which I love. I'd never thought about the time aspect of shopping until you mentioned it, but I think it's actually really powerful, because I think we waste so much time with fashion, and I love fashion.
Yeah, according to a study that BBC did, the average British consumer used their clothes 6 times. But there's also this phenomenon that we talk about in the book, the wardrobe's one-night stand. That is a party dress that you buy Friday afternoon, Friday night, just to wear that same evening, and then you'll never wear it again. So it's really a contrast to what we read about in these books, like from the 1930s, where you mend and change what you have, and you might have 3 dresses in your wardrobe, and you find ways to change these dresses. What do you say, Jill? Why do you think we ended up in the fast fashion?
I think that, can everyone hear me all right? I think that, fashion was never really that popular, which is a weird thing to say, but the sort of business of fashion, only in the last 10 years, people have really cared about, whether it's behind the scenes or, all the sort of crass, terrible things that we're now being bombarded with through reality TV shows or during fashion weeks. And, it used to be clothing. It hasn't actually, when you think about it, it hasn't been that long that it's all been about fashion. And so the sort of corporations have taken over, and they've seen this, and now it's just a business of profits only first, and it's a real it's having a really bad effect on creativity. And actually that's the thing that frustrates me and that I object to most about fast fashion is, everyone talks about the sustainability issues, which are clearly very important, but there's something much far-reaching and bigger in society, which is about subculture. Again, one of the reasons that which is highlighted very much in your book and the people that you spoke to, but it's also one of the reasons that we started Byron S, because there are no subcultures anymore. We basically live in a culture of American Apparel or H&M, and it's kind of sick of seeing everybody wearing exactly the same thing. And when everyone does look the same, then there's no imagination in the world. And that sounds like a sort of extravagant way of putting it, but the reasons why subcultures morph and bifurcate and become new things is how everyone gets inspired and we create new things. And really what ends up happening is we just go around in creative circles rather than there being progress. And that's why everything on the runway, talking about your very first point, looks the same. And it's not even just the fast fashion brands anymore, it's the corporations that are taking the kids that aren't even real designers and putting them in a sort of profitable role, which is a whole other debate.
We talked about this before, and you talked a lot about the importance of subcultures, and we talked also about the concept of DIY and how DIY almost became a dirty word fairly recently, and how DIY was important to subcultures and creativity and defining.
And DIY means do it yourself, for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah. And we want to show you some examples of what we call the recipe collection in the book, which is when we were traveling around the US and to Iceland, and we also went to Sweden and met people who had ideas and tips and tricks on how to alter and improve and do things with their clothes so they wouldn't have to buy new ones. And that was kind of the inspiration during the detox, and we thought it was a great thing to share with our readers in the book.
So this is Elliot. He's actually in the fashion industry, and he gave us this great recipe on how to age your chinos. So basically you do a wash with ropes and
tennis balls and I think he even threw old sneakers in there.
Yeah, and this is actually a secret recipe that they used at Ralph Lauren. So it's the kind of funny thing that this is something used in the fashion world, but this is also something that you can use on your own.
And here's one of the people that we met in Iceland, and Iceland was an interesting destination for us. We chose it because it's an isolated place geographically. It's a country that doesn't have any chain stores and doesn't have this, the same access as we do to fast fashion or fashion in general, perhaps. And this is Felipe, he's from France initially, but he's been living in Iceland for several years, and he takes old clothes that people don't want to use anymore and tears them up into these strips and creates these yarns, and then he crochets these beautiful twisted scarves. And he can name pretty much every dress and coat and t-shirt and tell the story about it that's in his scarves. So we thought that was a great recipe to have, and it's a great idea for what to do with your clothes when you can't wear them anymore.
Yeah, and also something that he said is that you should not be afraid to experiment with your clothes, because these days a lot of people are afraid of altering something because we don't know, we can't really relate to clothes, like we don't really know how they are made. So this is also a way to be kind of punkish with what you have.
Yeah, and we talk, we make a lot of references in the book to the food movement, and we talk about clothes as, ingredients and raw materials that you should be a bit braver with, and there to kind of investigate how the seams are made and how you can take things apart and put it back together again. It doesn't always have to involve a sewing machine, as you can see. We'll look at a few more.
This is Rachel, and she also lives in New York. She's from California, and she discovered this recipe when she needed to pull out a wisdom tooth, and she needed to stay at home for a few days. So she bought some thread and some needles, and decided that she was gonna cover up some stains that she had at a few shirts, and yeah. And so basically the recipe is a way to hide stains, but it's also a way to make an item a little bit more personal and also a little bit more fun.
Yeah, I like this one. This is our cover girl for the Swedish edition of the Fashion Manifesto. She lives in the Dirt Palace in Rhode Island, which is a feminist collective that's housed in an old library. They don't buy any new clothes ever. I doubt they actually buy anything new.
Except food.
Yeah. She has a very simple recipe. She has an old man's shirt that she puts her legs in, and with a few simple stitches she turns it into a pair of pants. So we like her.
And this is Alina, and she's from Ukraine, and her recipe is actually a family recipe, and it's very simple. You dig a hole and you put your t-shirts in the ground and let the ground do the work. So
I think they leave them over winter, I think.
Yeah, for 3 months in the ground, and it gives the t-shirts a great patina. And this is actually a technique that has been used in a lot of different countries. It's been used in Japan by a lot of denim companies for over 100 years. And if you look at some of the Ivy League schools, they actually used to dig down their shoes in the ground when they went away for the summer holidays. So to get a patina, this is a very well-tried recipe.
This is actually my favorite recipe of the book. This is Jette, she's also from Iceland, and she collects old rusty chains and pieces of old ships in the harbors of Reykjavik, and she steams her clothes with these rusty metal pieces and creates these patterns. I actually have no idea how she came up with this.
She had read about this recipe when she also did some research, early 1900, and she found that this is a technique that has been used. So she wanted to see if it was possible to use it today.
Yeah. So those are some of the examples. We have 50 recipes in the book, and they're all pretty easy to do. and we really want to show that you don't have to have a sewing machine, you don't have to have great skills in sewing or even fashion design to be able to own your clothes a bit more by personalize them and change them.
And this is something, a way to get the power back, so the consumer is more involved in clothes and in fashion. And I think before we move over to the manifesto, we should talk a little bit about vintage, because vintage is your specialty. And how do you give vintage a higher status?
Well, the biggest problem vintage has had, and still does, and something that we're trying to change in culture, is that people think that you have to look like you've stepped out of an episode of Mad Men or Austin Powers movie or something like that. And a lot of people are really frightened of vintage. They think, well, one, the stores are really smelly. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's not a nice experience. You have to rummage through a lot of shit. And then if you're not going to do that, you can be on eBay, and that's just the virtual version of it. So it's never been a really nice experience, which is one of the things that we're trying to change with Byronesque. But the thing that people fear the most is that, is it fashionable? Is it on trend, or is it something that everyone else is buying? And actually, that's the whole point of vintage, is that you're not buying something that everyone else is wearing. So when you add that with the fact that you're not going to end up looking like you've stepped out of a costume party, then it's just about the pieces themselves, and it's really simple. People think vintage is really complicated, and people have written books about how to shop for vintage. Is it in good quality? Does it look good? Do you like it? Does it fit? It's really simple. So we kind of got a bit frustrated about why everyone's tried to make vintage this really complicated thing, and it's really not.
And I think a lot of people think of vintage as well as just old clothes, perhaps, and something that they,
Well, the stigma of sort of wearing used clothes, unless you're in China and then you think you're wearing dead people's clothes and they won't wear it, but the stigma around it is completely different now. And the worst thing that's happened, I think, to the sort of used fashion market is this whole shop my closet trend that's happening at the moment, where people are literally just throwing up these little mini eBays online, and people are just selling anything out of their wardrobe. And it's not that I object to, it's the lack of curation, and that's one of the problems in the vintage industry, where people just go, well, this is just a big mess and I don't know how to sort through it. Whereas the contemporary market makes that really easy for you. They dictate, they say, we've sorted all of this for you, we made it really easy to shop, we've made it sexy and exciting, and sometimes it's really cheap and sometimes it's too cheap. And so no one had done that in vintage. It's still very much, well, here's a lot of old clothes. So I think that's one of the things about making it easy for people to shop.
And it's also what you find with new clothes is the perfection, obviously, and the old clothes might have imperfections.
Well, I mean, that's the best bit. I mean, my clothes are full of holes, and I actually purposefully sit and I make the holes. There's a thing that we say at Byronesque, is that the clothes don't have wear and tear, they have scars, because scars tell a story and they're very unique to a person. And if I'm buying a piece of vintage Vivienne Westwood, and I can tell a story that it's from the Blitz Club in the 80s, and whatever it is, then that's way more interesting to me than saying, oh, where did you get your Tory Burch pumps? Which is what everybody's able to talk about. So the reality is, for me and for everyone at Byronesque anyway, perfect is really boring and it's not interesting. And I get way more excited about people like the chain lady, who it's ingenious. There are people, and you'll attest to this, there are designers who work furiously trying to create certain patterns. They try out those certain things. If you go back in history and you look at Yohji Yamamoto or Com or designers like that, they messed around with things to try and create new stuff. The difference is that what they make ends up being thousands of dollars at Barney's, and she's the stigma around this thing is that that's homemade. It's DIY, and actually DIY. When you look back, when people had no money, there was a huge amount of creativity.
Yeah, and it's also something about personalizing things and really claiming ownership in that way, which we've experienced a lot when we've been traveling and making this book and talking to people who do dabble with the clothes. And I think that also ties in with the scars, as you call them, with the clothes, because they do tell stories. And if you have a story and a memory attached to what you wear and what you own, then you're more likely to take care of it and be proud of it and have it longer. It kind of brings us back to the manifesto that we wrote for the book as well, where we have 7 fashion rules with quite practical tips for how to relate to clothes and consumption and fashion. I'll just go back to the manifesto. This is a summary of the manifesto that we
created. Yeah, we created it based on the conversations we had with all the people that we met, but also going through old books and trying to figure out how can you relate to fashion and consumption today, because there's no guideline except basically buy. And so we created these 7 fashion rules, and one of the rules is we resist shopping impulses. And for this rule we read a lot of psychology reports just to see how what is the mechanism of consumption, and how can we as consumers be smarter when we go into stores. And a few tips that we discovered, for example, was that we understand that shopping is not a hobby, and we understand that the sales associates are not our friends. They are actually there to sell us things. We don't shop unless we're on top, because if you're feeling low, you're more likely to buy something just because you need a kick. We also discovered that if you touch an item, you're more likely to buy it. So you should actually be pretty aware of that if you touch something, you start to dream about the time when you're going to wear this item, what is the scenario going to be like, and then you're likely to bring it home.
Even though you might not need it for the rest of your life. But what we talked about before was, the idea of having these personal relationships to clothes, but you might not always buy a piece of garment to wear for the rest of your life. But in the last rule, I'm part of the well-dressed revolution, we give tips on what you can do to kind of prolong the life of the clothes that you own. And we talk about having clothes swapping parties and donating clothes to friends, or actually assigning friends or family members to inherit your garments. And Sofia has a great story that happened during the fashion detox, right?
Yeah. I was working out at my gym, and in the locker room this woman approached me and said that she had seen me on a few occasions and she liked my style. And she had a lot of clothes that she wasn't using because she felt that she was too old for these clothes. So she asked me if I wanted to accept a clothing gift from her. And I had actually seen her, and I liked her style, so I said yes. And a few days later, I went to her apartment, and she gave me 13 dresses. And she made me promise that whenever I felt that I couldn't wear them anymore, I didn't suit my lifestyle, I should give them to someone else. And this was really something beautiful that I often think about, and it makes me want to do the same with a stranger.
Sounds good.
Yeah, what are your advices to consumers who want to be more aware and conscious?
I think there is something to be said for the stories that you I think they've kind of come out of all of you. And having gone for 2 years without shopping, I can really speak to the first 2 points, and also the one, I love my clothes. Because I think that was the most beautiful thing about not shopping for 2 years, really getting to know what I actually had in my closet. And also then learning what my style was through, because there were things that I owned that I really shouldn't have, well, I no longer own. Because over time you just get to know that some things don't work. And I think because of the pace that we go through through clothes, like the pace of acquisition and then disposal, we don't really get to engage with the clothes, and that I think is the biggest missing in the relationships that we have with our clothes. And that would be my biggest tip, is really just get to know what you actually have and how it works on you. Because once you start to understand what works on you and what your style is, I think shopping becomes so much easier, and you do a lot less of it too, because you just know it's, and you don't worry so much about what us fashion people tell you, because we tell you terrible things. We lie to you all the time, and.
But this is also something that actually happens through the detox. If you do a detox, you will discover things about yourself and your style that you didn't know before.
Yeah.
And we have a few exercises in the book that you should do, but it also kind of happens unconsciously while you go through the detox.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jill? What should you do to become more aware and conscious and smart?
Actually, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Don't buy Vogue. Don't read these magazines that tell you have to look like the latest celebrity who's been dressed by either a good or bad stylist, and and just stop following what everyone else is doing. And and you've got to figure out your own style. And that style might be very uniform, and that's the way I dress, or it might be very varied, and that's all good. But I think if it's hard to break the clothing addiction to start with, cut off the magazines, cut off the source.
I really I can't stress that enough. I thought for about 15 years that I couldn't live without French Vogue. Like, French Vogue was the magazine that I had to buy every month, until I moved from Australia to New York, and I had to deal with the volumes of French Vogues that I'd kept through all that time, and that's when I stopped buying French Vogue. And my life didn't really change for the worse when I stopped buying it. In fact, quite the contrary. I mean, I still love the magic of like a beautiful editorial and all of that, but the kind of language of fashion magazines I find very problematic, where they tell you that you have to have whatever it is that they tell you that you have to have, which is usually not very different to the thing that they told you before that you had to have.
There's some amazing magazines and websites out there that are very experimental and really creative, and might make you think differently about what you might wear with something. I mean, you've got a woman in that book that layered 2 skirts with each other, and she looked awesome, and that's a old styling trick, but they don't use it anymore in Vogue and things like that because the advertisers won't like it. So pick the magazines that genuinely, are experimental.
Yeah. If we move over to the designer's perspective, because that was also something that I discovered throughout my shopping detox. When I went to fashion weeks and interviewed designers, that a lot of them were actually bored with the speed of the trends. I interviewed, for example, Albert Elbas of Lanvin, and he said that he just wanted to do one good collection that people would actually wear for a long time, rather than doing several collections a year. What do you tell your students, and how do your students feel about the speed and also the change in the fashion?
It's quite an interesting time to be in fashion education, particularly in New York, because the pace of at which the companies produce collections is immense. I spoke with a former student in the spring, and she had calculated that she has 25 minutes to design each garment in a collection. And basically, you can't design anything in 25 minutes. Basically what you do to be able to do that is you get you copy a lot of images from online. And this was, a student that a year earlier, she was one of the most informed students as far as sustainability goes that I've ever had. The good thing is, I think every year, I've been teaching for 11 years now, and every year there's a growing number of students who are interested in the issues, and I think it kind of goes back to what people like Albert Elbaz says. You can't, and also to that 25 minutes, you can't do anything in 25 minutes. It actually does take time to do things beautifully, and I think students understand that very quickly as well. That in order to, but I think sometimes we as educators, we forget that because we push them to just churn out too much, and there is something to be said. I mean, in my own practice, because I still do design a little bit, but really I've only designed this shirt and a couple of other things in the last 4 years, and I just keep redesigning the same shirt. And
slow fashion.
Yeah. Because I think there's something quite beautiful about just being with an idea for a time as well. Because it's not just fashion that has gotten really fast; it's everything really. It's everything is so instant, and like even the way we use Pinterest and things like that. It's like this. I can't keep up anymore. That's why I need to go into the woods every now and again.
I am curious about how you, because your role is about sustainability, and what is it that you focus on the most? Is it more the environmental aspect, or is it the pace, and what do you think what can the students bring with them when they come out of their college, their education?
As far as what's the focus, that in my class at least, that's very much driven by the students, so whatever their interests are. Often it is the environmental, but particularly after the past year, where back in September in Pakistan 300 people died in a garment factory fire, then in November 120 people died in another garment factory fire in Bangladesh, and then of course in April 1100 people died in the Rana Plaza factory collapse. When things like that happen, you can't ignore them anymore. And again, I think catastrophes like that are really an acute kind of sign of how things have just escaped out of control in fashion. But at the same time, I'm optimistic because the thinking that I get to see from students on a daily basis, I mean, I think I've got like the best job in the world, because I get to work with the future of fashion and the brilliant thinking that is in there. And even that former student that I mentioned who's having to churn out a garment design every 25 minutes, I see my role as being just keeping that thinking alive that was in her 2 years ago. Because she might be a junior designer right now with very little power in the industry, but give her another 3-4 years, she's going to be one of the leaders, and that's where the difference is going to come from. And that's why I do think that's why I have, despite all the catastrophes, I've got room to be optimistic, because I get to work with the future on a daily basis.
I'm way less optimistic and more cynical than you. Because don't they just get sucked into corporate jobs and then they're in the machine again? And I don't believe that while fashion's being dumbed down, and while people can still buy an entire outfit for $10 or whatever, I don't think people are. This is a massively sweeping statement, but I don't think people these days care enough or are educated enough to think that somebody somewhere is getting screwed because they bought that outfit for $11 or whatever it is. So I think I mean I don't know what the answer is, and I think the big retailers are obviously the only ones who can probably change it.
And it's a political question as well. Yeah. Because fashion exists in a larger context of the economic system in which we all exist, which is almost entirely focused on profit and growth. And for me to even publicly question I would call it the sanity of pursuing economic growth, when that really is in the longer term a physical impossibility, because we actually live on a planet that isn't growing. And despite what some economists say, the economy is actually tied to the planet on which we exist. But to question growth, because I mean our societal well-being is most of the time discussed in terms of growth. I mean, you read the news and you know, no growth is bad and growth is good, and it might work for the short term, but if we look at even the next 50 years, that's not a system that's going to carry us. And that's where I get worried, because, and that's where my optimism can start to crumble. But there are signs. I mean, there was someone in the House of Lords in the UK, a politician, who actually said it out loud and said that we need to actually maybe question this dominance. And so there is hope, I think.
Yeah, if we're staying in the future a little, looking at the consumer of the future, how do you think we will buy clothes in 10 years, and what is your dream scenario? What are you hoping for, and what do you think is realistic? We start with you, Gill.
Blimey. If I knew that answer, I'd be a rich woman. Well, my hope is that there's not so much crap sold. My hope is that, you know, I mean, I don't really believe in the democratization of fashion. You know, I think it's just a stupid marketing trick to make us all buy more rubbish. But I do believe that, you know, there should be inexpensive things for people to buy. So my hope would be that there are less fast fashion stores in the world, and that there's some emerging subcultures like the new sort of hip-hop goth scene that's starting to emerge, and, you know, we see more of that, and we see more DIY, and that designers don't have to churn out 9 you know, collections a season, and it just all slows down.
What do you say, Timo?
The consumer in 10 years.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a lot of the kinds of things that you have in the book. It'll be those kinds of practices, but amplified, and also more
vintage.
More vintage. I've actually been involved in a project over the last 2 years called Local Wisdom, which is an international, with 7 universities around the world. And really, what we've been researching is kind of, it in some ways parallels some of the stories that you show in the book, which is really investigating how everyday people use clothes, but then amplifying those use practices through design. And I think the consumer of the future will be more educated and more savvy and just more empowered to do stuff. You know, if like to even get a pair of scissors into a garment, which most of us still don't do, and I would highly encourage it. Even get a stapler, and you can do amazing things with staplers and clothes. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have been a very snobby fashion designer and just be horrified with that statement. But now I'm just like, just do whatever makes it work for you. I mean, it's...
Yeah, but look at the most seminal and robbed, diluted, you know, subculture of all time, which was punk. And, you know, this I'm going to do a shameful plug, but we've got an interview with Joe Corey, who's Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's son, coming up on the site soon. But he says this brilliant thing. He said that probably one of the most important things that Malcolm gave to culture was that he told people they didn't have to work down coal mines. They could get a packet of safety pins and go and be in a rock band. You know, and look what that created. And, you know, and then they ruined it and they put this thing called Chaos to Couture in the Met. But it showed you what came out of a bunch of safety pins, you know. So the point is that it has far-reaching effects.
I think that's a great statement to kind of end our conversation with, and it would be great to hear if anyone has any questions or comments or anything they want to add to tonight before we wrap it up. In that case, I think it's a wrap. And thank you again so much for coming. I really enjoyed it. Yes. Sure.
Yeah, I thought do you think that, how close do you think we are to the point in terms of people being more aware and not, you know, not, and actually realizing that we just want to see this period of time until how far away is that, and what do you think?
As I see it, there's a growing subculture of awareness, and that's basically where we are at the moment. It's more like a subculture rather than like the masses are aware. And I hope that if we look at the food movement, that we will be inspired by the food movement, and in 5 years that the average consumer will be more aware. Because as I see it, we're almost 10 years behind the awareness when it comes to food. And that's also one of the reasons we make a lot of food comparisons in the book, just to see, this kind of inspire people to see that you can be aware when it comes to food, but you can also be aware when it comes to fashion and clothing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. If you haven't already checked out the Fashion Manifesto, we do have copies available as you exit the Rare Book Room. Thank you for coming tonight.